Good morning. I'm Richard, and I'm one of the teachers for the Junior 2 Sunday School class here at Redeemer United Church of Christ. And this morning we have an opportunity, our second opportunity, to have a press conference with our pastor, Reverend Bowers.
Good morning. Welcome to our second youth conference here at Redeemer United Church of Christ on this little bit chilly Super Bowl Sunday. I'm Reverend Peter Bauer, and it's a joy for me to be with you. Gracie?
So one of the questions I had was, so there are all of these scientific explanations on how Earth was created, like the evolution of man and stuff. How does that pair with how simple the Bible states it? Like just God created heavens and the earth, Adam and Eve. So just how does that pair up?
Grayson, you asked a very intelligent, well-articulated question, something that has really been debated down through the centuries. The long and the short of it is, when the Genesis text was put together, and this probably was over a series of many years, how people described their experience in life was much different from ours, vastly different. And so their conception of 7 days was not necessarily as we understand it. Time had a completely different understanding. Also, you're talking about a time still when a number of people were literate versus those who were not literate. And so therefore, in order to communicate well with people, you had to really keep things simple, and you had to keep things kind of like basically painting a visual picture for people. Where things get complicated now in 2021 is that we know through science, and we know through archaeology, and we know through carbon data, etc., that the world as we know it is millions and millions of years old. And so therefore, when we look at the text and it says 7 days, you really have to think, in my opinion, you really have to think allegorically. You have to think symbolically. One of the things that's happened within the last 100 years with the rise of fundamentalism in the 19th century is that there was this idea that if we were true to exactly what the word said in the Bible, that we were actually getting to truth. That's debatable. If we look at what happened with the church earlier and with Christianity earlier, that was not the case.
Okay. If Adam and Eve were just one culture, how did all of the other cultures form?
Another great question. And we can kind of maybe piggyback on some of the things that we mentioned last week. First of all, from what we have in Genesis, we have a text that really talks about what? An agrarian society, much like Redeemer. So people tilled the earth, they tilled the land. It's not until what? It's not going to be really until about the 18th or 19th century that we really see industrialization. We see the rise of cities and everything else. So we're talking about basically an agrarian culture. By the time, however, the late Middle Ages comes on the scene, we start having the rise of what's called mercantilism, which means that we're going to see shop owners, we're going to see people starting their own businesses, etc. That having been said, when we talk about diversity within the Bible, we have basically a group of people who go from an agrarian society to becoming more clustered into urban areas at some point. And then with Jesus, we have what? We have the initial group of people who are called followers of the way, which later becomes known as Christians, probably around 88 Common Era. And then everything becomes, for lack of better words, it's under the umbrella of Catholicism, basically, until about the 15th century. At that time, then, there's this very interesting group of people in Italy called the Waldensians, who basically say, no, we want to have a faith where we have direct contact to God. We don't want to have to deal with any type of hierarchy. So it's really the Waldensians who kick off this conversation. They're heavily persecuted at that time by the Roman Catholic Church. And then it's with 1517 that Luther comes on the scene and basically says sola scriptura, which basically says Scripture speaks for itself. And that's what really kicks off the Reformation. And then everything that we have seen since then in terms of denominations getting started and founding, and maybe later splintering off and becoming new entities, really goes back to that date. Is that helping? Good.
What would happen if Jesus didn't die on the cross?
Wonderful question about this last week. In traditional, what I would call Orthodox or Neo-Orthodox Christianity, there's been a real importance of what? Looking at what I would call the saving power of Jesus. That we have our salvation by virtue of the fact that Jesus died on the cross, rose from the dead, and so therefore we have eternal life. But that was only one interpretation, interestingly enough. We now know from research that's been done through several people, but two people who've done a lot of research on this, Rita Nakashima Brock and Rebecca Ann Parker, through their work that they did, primarily archaeological work and art historian work, that there was a whole movement going on about the 14th and 15th century that focused on creationism and focused on creation spirituality. And so through a lot of the work that Rita Nakashima Brock and Rebecca Ann Parker unearthed, there's all of these frescoes that you see in various parts of Italy, and they don't show crosses, but instead they show deer, they show landscapes, they show waterfalls, they show other things. So there's this consensus that's now being formed that even back in the 14th and 15th century, there were people who very much believed in Jesus, that were very much a part of the Christian movement, but they didn't put a great emphasis so much on the crucifixion. They looked at other things in terms of nature, and they looked at other things in terms of the spirit that really, really enriched a believer's life. So, what would our faith look like without a crucifixion and resurrection, or per se? It would look probably very, very, very different. It would look more in terms of being. I don't want to go so far as to say it wouldn't look like totally nature loving, but there would be a real emphasis, I think, in looking at the power of creation and what nature does for us and what nature generates in us.
Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were held captives in Babylonia, but their names were changed. What were their Hebrew names?
That's a good one. I'm not sure what their Hebrew names were. You know, it might be worthy to do a Google search and see what would come up with that. Have you tried that yet?
Yes. No, Meshach was Michelle, and then Shadrach was Hananiah, and Abednego was Azariah.
Okay, so that's good. So what does that tell you about language? What does that tell you about what people do with language and what they do with their identity?
Well, whenever they were taking them captives, they changed their names because they were trying to completely, brainwash them basically into worshiping the gods in Babylonia, so that they weren't.
And they might have done it because they wanted to keep a low profile. You know, if you have a force come in and take over your country and take over your life and are oppressing you, what are you likely to want to do?
Keep a low profile.
Keep a low profile, yeah. If you want to survive, that's probably the smartest thing you can do in that sense. So that may have been partially to play in terms of what happened with the name change. I'm only conjecturing, but that's what I would sense. Great question.
If Jesus, if he died on the cross, right, and then he was resurrected, is he immortal? If he didn't go up to heaven, ever have died, or was he just like a regular human?
Well, that's a real good question. Again, what do we have? The biblical text, particularly the Gospel of John, says what? That God was pre-existent. God was pre-existent to Jesus, and that the Word was pre-existent to Jesus as well. If you read the first chapter of the Gospel of John, that's what that says. There's been debate about when Jesus was on earth, if he was fully cognizant of the fact that he was going to die, period, or whether this was an evolved consciousness that occurred for him during his life. Keep in mind that from what we know, that Jesus lived somewhere in the neighborhood of about 30 to 33 years. Probably was born somewhere in the time frame of about maybe 4 BC and probably, or 3 BC, 4 to 3 BC, and died in the neighborhood of probably around 30 AD, all right? And during that time frame, then, Jesus' public ministry, per documented in the Gospels, is what? It's only 3 years. So what we don't know is what was Jesus really thinking about prior to the public ministry. And even when the public ministry starts, what do we have? Interestingly enough, and this you see this a lot in the Gospel of Mark, we see Jesus saying what? I'm going to do good stuff for you, but don't tell anybody, okay? You see this again and again and again. Jesus does a teaching, Jesus does a miracle, and what's the next thing out of his mouth? Shh, don't tell anybody. So we have this whole thing called the Messianic secret going on. And then we have this whole thing about, does Jesus fully comprehend what's going to be happening to him? And it's as the Gospels proceed, of course, we start hearing Jesus talk about predictions of his death. But I would say that's a real interesting question about whether or not, if Jesus didn't die, what would happen? I would still say, or contend, that if Jesus hadn't have died, that God would still be pre-existent, that God would still be, the creator and ruler and redeemer of the universe.
Morning, Richard.
Good morning.
We've been reading and studying some in the 15th chapter of John.
Mm-hmm.
And in that chapter, verse 16, Jesus said, if you ask my Father anything in my name, he will answer that prayer. It will be given unto you. What did he mean by in my name? And did he really mean anything that we asked?
Once again, an excellent textual question. Jesus is going to say, that you ask this in my name. Why? Partially because at the time that these Gospels are being written, what is happening in Judea? There's a lot of other people who are purporting to be prophets. There's a lot of other people who are purporting to be teachers. There's a lot of other people who are purporting to be what? Miracle workers. If you look at the text, it will say, in fact, do not follow as these others are doing. That's basically saying, we know there's a smorgasbord out there right now with regard to people who are what? Purporting to do miracles, purporting to do teachings, purporting to do all kinds of things. That was very much the case in the first century in the Hellenistic Judaism period. So one of the reasons why you have the gospel writers indicating that Jesus is saying this is to what? To say, I know that there's all these other people running around doing all of these things, but we want to highlight what? How Jesus is distinct, how Jesus is different. So that is going on. The other thing about asking everything, if you ask anything in my name, it will come. Again, I think it's trying to say, among other things, that Jesus is paramount. Jesus is significant. Jesus is distinct over all of these other religious entities that are out there, okay? Now, does it mean that, I want a Mercedes-Benz, so will Jesus provide me a Mercedes-Benz? I think that's rather questionable, You got people, however, like Cofield Dollar and other prosperity people who would say, oh yeah, sure, pray and Jesus will give you a Mercedes. I'm not about to say that, and I think a lot of other people would be in concurrence and would be in agreement with me as well. So I think you always have to look at what's being said in the Gospels in terms of what does it literally say, what could it symbolically say, and within Hebrew literature, within Hebrew tradition, there's always this tendency to what? Over-exaggerate, to kind of put things into absurdum. You especially see that when they use humor. very much there. And so you have to remember again that the gospel writers were what? The gospel writers again were writing out of a Hebrew Jewish tradition. And so you can't ignore that, and you can't overlook that at all.
So here's another question. Back in like historical times, like say the Roman era, when it talks about the Catholic Church, it's like extremely tied to Christianity. So how does like Christianity differ from Catholicism?
Well, another great question. You know, you're not alone in this. I have people that I see elsewhere who will always say what? That this is a common mantra I hear. I was raised Catholic, but now I'm Christian. Don't you like that? I was raised Catholic, but now I'm Christian. That's kind of what we call oxymoronic. It points two different ways. It doesn't say anything really nice about Catholicism, and it doesn't say anything nice about Christianity. Going back to what you and I talked about last week, here it goes. You know, the church gets founded where? The church gets founded at Pentecost, right? Which we think may have been somewhere in the time frame of, I don't know, 50, 55 Common Era. And remember, this is like what? This is post-Jesus by about, what, 20 years, all right? We then have the people of the way who emerge. We then have 88 Common Era. Now, why is that important? Because that's when the people of the way are going to split off from the Hellenistic Jewish worshiping community, because at this point, all the followers of Jesus were still worshiping in the synagogue. By about 88 Common Era, they decide to part company, so they start worshiping on their own. And so that's the beginning of what we're going to be seeing as the institutionalized church. We then have what? As I mentioned last week, we have the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, which really put together the Nicene Creed, which a lot of Christians use and worship, including us. And then we have, by about 400 AD, we really have what? The church being organized, and here we're talking Catholic Church, in terms of what? Pope, archbishops, bishops, etc. And that rolls on virtually until what? 1517, with Luther coming on the scene. And keep in mind, Luther initially didn't want to leave the Catholic Church. Luther wanted to be a good, faithful Augustinian monk. He was all about what? Wanting to reform the church from inside. But once Luther puts the 95 Theses on the door for the Wittenberg Church, the door gets open for what? Interpretation, difference of opinion, and so then you have what? You have Luther, you have Calvin, you have Zwingli, you have a modern reformers still, and that's when you started to see what? The proliferation of different denominations take place. Going up into the 19th century with the Christian Church forming in the United States, and then with our own United Church of Christ coming from the Congregationalists, coming from the Christian Church, and coming from the Evangelical and Reformed tradition, all merging finally in 1957.
Well, let me ask you this. You know, historians say that the United States was initially founded under Judeo-Christian principles and values. Today it seems that we're sort of drifting away from that. Would you agree that our founding was Judeo-Christian? And what are the consequences of us drifting away from those beginnings?
Well, I agree. We are socialized as Americans to be under, quote, the Judeo-Christian belief system. However, folks in the 18th century looked vastly different from us. They did. And they believe vastly different from us. Look at, I'll cite you two examples. Look at Thomas Jefferson. Look at Benjamin Franklin. What were they in terms of their faith? They weren't really what I would call Orthodox Christians in one sense. They were really influenced by deism, which is spelled D-E-I-S-M. And what is that concept? Again, this was really popular within the 18th century. And the idea of deism was what? God is out there, but God is really out there kind of like as a remote controller, okay? We are here and we have free will and we have our ability to act, but God is just kind of remote. That's vastly different, I would submit and argue, in terms of what you see with the rise of Orthodox Christianity. That still doesn't mean that that's not a part of Christendom as it's understood in the 18th century, but that was there. You know, you probably have some deists running around today in 2021, but they're not going to be nearly in significant number as they were in the 18th century, okay? That's one point. The second point is, we're at a point now in our culture, in our society, where Christianity is still very much here. We haven't died, we haven't gone away. Judaism, as we know it, has not died, has not gone away. Yes, we have a proliferation now of Muslims, of Islam. We have a proliferation now, to some degree, of Buddhists. We have a proliferation now of Hindus. We have a proliferation now of other religions. I think that's all good. I think that reflects the diversity of the country. I think what we need to do in terms of, you know, again, being true to our roots, which is the Judean-Christian mindset and the Judean-Christian religion, I think we need to uplift what I would call the best virtues of the Judeo-Christian religion. And that would be what? Honor God and be able to what? Do unto others as we would have them do unto us. You know? And really what? Really be about compassion and really be about mercy for others.
Okay, Richard here again. We have one student that wasn't here this morning, but he prepared some questions, and I want to share those questions with you and see if we can get an answer. And Cass is the author of these questions. He wanted to know who wrote the Bible.
That's another great question. And I would say hundreds, if not thousands of people wrote the Bible. Because again, we're talking about a development that goes from what? Oral stories that are being circulated about how the earth, how creation gets started, how the earth is formed, how the first humans arrive, how major figures within the Hebrew tradition emerge. All of this starts from what? Oral stories, to then stuff being written down, to then stuff finally being what? Put in some type of editing fashion, and to where what? We actually have written things down in terms of gospels and letters and books, etc. From what we know, the books that were edited finally in the Old Testament or the Hebrew canon don't kind of really come to surface until about 190 BC, and this is with what's called the Council of Yamnia, all right? And then what we have in terms of New Testament canon doesn't really get consolidated at all in terms of its final form until well into the 2nd century, okay? So that's a long period of time, isn't it? Between when Jesus is born, when Jesus has his ministry, and when Jesus dies and when he's resurrected, in terms of everything that occurs following that.
Cass's second question was, what is diversity?
Diversity within our religious tradition is, again, going back to what we've seen historically. We have, within Judaism, we have groups that what? And I'm speaking here on pretty solid ground. We have people within Judaism that would say, no resurrection, not at all. Then we have other groups within Judaism who say what? Yes, we do. All right, then we get to what we call the New Testament period and Christianity. And if we talk about what was happening in early Christianity, we have a lot of diversity. We have what? We have a group called the Arians, or Arian Christianity, that says what? This may shock you, but they said what? The Arians thought Jesus is a nice guy, Jesus is good, but we don't think Jesus is necessarily divine. Okay? Then we have another group called what? The Docetists, who say what? Well, yes, God came to us and God was with us, but when Jesus was on the cross, God wasn't really there. God retreated. And so there's more of this notion, like deism, right? Of the remote God. Then we had another group called the Gnostics, right? And what did they believe? They believed that everything, the most important thing is the spirit, all right? And so therefore, when we die, we then go to the heavens, right? We go to be with God. But the Gnostics had this interesting notion that there were 7 layers that how you got to heaven. And so that as kind of like purgatory, that as you progressed, you got better and better and better. Okay? So all of this smorgasbord is going on where? All of this is going on incredibly in like the 2nd century. All of this is going on. Okay? And we don't really have, again, we don't have any real kind of call to, quote, orthodox Christian thought until what? 325 with the Council of Nicaea. That's when things get solidified. And that's when we have people saying, well, this is true, this is orthodox, this is different, this is heresy. And since then, we've had what? A continuing development of people say, well, I want to be able to look and think about what feels comfortable or appropriate for me in terms of my religious journey. And so we see that in Christianity today, in terms of people who would be considered liberal in terms of their Christian belief, those who would be more conservative, and those who would be more moderate in between.
Well, we've come to the end of this session, and I want to thank you all for being with us this morning. I don't know about you, but I've learned quite a bit, and I hope it motivates each and every one of us to dig a little deeper into this subject so that we can have a better understanding about Christianity. Thank you for being with us.